Welcome to Manna-Fest, hosted by international evangelist, teacher, and author Perry Stone. Enjoy unique insight into prophetic and practical truth. It's time to feast on fresh manna, so get ready to be blessed and encouraged. And now, here is your host and teacher, Perry Stone.
We want to welcome you to Manna-Fest. I'm coming to you from Israel. If you were with me right now on this hill I'm standing on, it is between the city of Bethlehem, which is behind me, and the city of Jerusalem, which is in front of me. What a beautiful day. It's rained a little bit this morning, and usually when it rains and the wind blows, and you will hear some wind blowing on my microphone today where we're standing, it just clears up this area. It is incredible. Just to kind of get the imagery of where we're at, Bethlehem is directly behind me. The Dead Sea is over in this direction. The mountains of Edom and Moab, it's a clear day today. You can see those. That's the country of Jordan. But I have a word for you today that I want to share with you that's very significant, and I'm going to need your undivided attention for about the next 20 to 21 minutes. I'm going to be dealing with you what I believe is the biggest key to getting your prayers answered. And you're going to say, it's faith. Well, you have to have faith, but it's not faith. Well, it's just making sure you pray consistently. That's true, but that's not what it is. Well, it's praying and not wavering. That's true. When you pray, you have to believe and not waver, but that's not the key. As a matter of fact, when you ask people what is the number one thing that you have to have that gets your most important, significant, effective prayers answered, no one that you talk to, I say no one, there may be 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20, but almost no one can tell you what it is. For you to understand answered prayer and for you to understand the significance of answered prayer, let's talk about, just for a few moments, about the tabernacle of Moses and the temple in Jerusalem. The tabernacle of Moses and the temple in Jerusalem both had what was called a priesthood. There was one high priest who was appointed for life, and when he died, his oldest son would take his place. So the priesthood of the Old Testament was what we call hereditary. Now, the first king and priest unto God in the Bible is Genesis 14, Melchizedek. That was not his name, that was his title, but he's called the first king and priest of the Most High God. However, the priesthood was originated through the sons of Levi and through Aaron, who was, of course, a relative to Moses, and the Levites became the priest of both the tabernacle and the temple. There were 2 temples in Jerusalem, one the Temple of Solomon, and the other one was called the Second Temple, which was added onto by Herod the Great. And so the priesthood was significant because of the garments that they wore. Now, the high priest had 2 specific garments. One was called his garments of beauty. It's mentioned in the book of Exodus, and I won't go through all of those, but you know, he had the gold mitre, the gold crown that said holy unto the Lord upon his head. He had a bonnet that he wore. He had an ephod that he wore. He had garments, specific garments of different colors that he wore. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Now, what we call the regular Levites were individuals who basically wore linen garments, and they were 4 types of garments. There were linen pants, there was a linen robe, there was a linen sash, and then they wore a linen headdress. Now, today, among the Arab people or the Bedouin people, you will see a headdress that's a covering, and it looks like a little rope. They tie it around their head to hold it in place. Well, the priest had something very similar to this, and one of the reasons for it was as they ministered making sacrifices, you didn't want hair to mix in with the blood, nor did you want sweat to mix in with the animal sacrifice. So a lot of times the headdress protected that from taking place. So the normal Levites wore 4 linen garments on a consistent basis, and when they would become covered with blood, they would exchange those garments for new garments. But the high priest had garments of royalty and beauty, but one time a year, the priests were to take off the 8 garments of beauty, and he was to put on 4 of the linen garments, and that was on the Day of Atonement. And this is when he would go into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for himself, for the Levites, and for the Israelites. Now, as a part of this, in fact, let me read this verse to you, and we're going to take this verse and we're going to expound on it. And this is when David went down to Ziklag, and when Ziklag was invaded by the Amalekites, and the Amalekites came in and took the wives, the children, the spoil, and burnt the city, And everyone was so depressed, the men thought about killing David and stoning him. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, and he received this word from God to go pursue, overtake, and recover all. But the word came through something which was called inquiring of the Lord through the ephod. Now watch this. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, and David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought hither the ephod to David. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. Now the ephod, and it's in the English Bible, is spelled E-P-H-O-D. It's mentioned 52 times in the Old Testament. And it was a part of the garment of the priest. Now, let's follow, you got to follow me through to this as I get to this real significant part of what is the one thing that makes your prayers most effective, and what is the one thing that in my lifetime, in my father's lifetime, who was the greatest praying man that I ever met, he could get prayers answered swiftly, and this was his key. Now again, if I were to ask you, you would say it has to be faith, it has to be quoting the word, it has to be praying without wavering. All of those things are true, but that was not the key that I saw during his entire ministry, where 16 people were healed of cancer just after he retired from ministry, traveling with me in revivals and traveling on his own. What was my dad's key to answered prayer? I'll tell you about that in a moment, because that's what I want to teach you today on the Manna-Fest telecast. Now, take a look at this, because this is very important. On the Old Testament high priest, there was something called the breastplate. And the breastplate was woven with different types of there was the purple, there was the scarlet, there was the blue, and it was woven together. And then there were 12 beautiful semi-precious gemstones that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And each of those gemstones were carved with the name of the tribe, whether it be Benjamin or Judah, Asher, Issachar, Naphtali, whatever. And there were three, the top section of the breastplate had 3 stones, then the next row was 3, 3, and 3, a total of 12. Now, there was something called inquiring of the Lord that existed back in the time of the tabernacle and back in the time of the temple. One of the ways you inquired of the Lord was called casting lots. Now, the best example for me to give you of what casting lots was is on the Day of Atonement, when the high priest would have the 2 goats, one marked for Azazel, one marked for the Lord, standing in front of him. There was a box that was about this size of this Bible, and he would pray and lift his head to heaven and reach in, and he would have what was called a lottery. It was made of wood with brass on the top. Another one was made of wood with brass on the top, 2 of them, and one was for Azazel, the other was for the Lord. Now, Azazel was believed to have been, there's several traditions about the name Azazel, but it represented Satan. So Azazel was the scapegoat. That was the goat the priest laid his hands on, and when the priest laid his hands upon that scapegoat, then that goat was turned loose into the wilderness where it died. And then we discover also that the goat for the Lord was offered on the altar. Now, when the priest wanted to inquire of the Lord, one of the ways of inquiring was casting lots. That was just one of several methods that could be used, called casting lots. Another way of inquiring of the Lord was when the priest would take the breastplate on the royal garments and stand in front of the 7-branched menorah, and as he would stand there, he would pray a prayer, and the light from the menorah would light up on those certain stones and give him a word from God. Like if they were going to war, they would say, who should go to war, who should lead us? And the stone of Judah may light up. And this is how he knew a word from God, was through that method. There were other methods that were used in the Old Testament to hear from God, and one of those was called the ephod. Now here's where it gets interesting. On the garment of the high priest, you had 2 onyx stones upon his shoulders. They're traditionally a dark black stone, a very beautiful polished stone, and over here on one side of his shoulder was for the 6 tribes of Israel, 6 names, and over here on the other side were 6 names. So he had 6 and 6. Now it was connected by a chain that was connected to the breastplate. Now, what would happen is this: the ephod, and you got to follow me with this, because this is important. Why were there 2 stones with the 12 tribes on his shoulders, and why were there 12 stones right over here over his chest? And here's the answer. The high priest was to carry Israel over his heart, meaning that the children of Israel all the time were over his heart, represented by their names on the 12 semi-precious gemstones. Then you had the 6 and 6 on the shoulder. Now watch this, meaning that the high priest had to carry the burden of Israel on his shoulders. So there were two parts to this. Number one, they were in his heart, and number two, they were on his shoulders. Now I can stop right there and begin to tell you that when they inquired of the Lord, they used the ephod, which was a part of the breastplate, to get a word from God to determine what they should do. And here's the point. In emergency situations, they would take and inquire of the Lord using the ephod, and they would receive very quick answers to God. This is exactly what David did when he was at Ziklag and the invasion took place, and he didn't know where the people had went. He didn't know where the wives and the children had been taken. He didn't even know where the Amalekites, where they had gone. And so he had to inquire of God, and God said, pursue, overtake, and recover all, after he inquired of the ephod. Now here is the story of the ephod as it relates to you and I. The ephod, a part of it was emergency intercession. Now, they used it during emergencies, because this is not the only verse in the Bible where we can find it talks about the ephod. As I told you, it's mentioned about 50, let me give you the exact number. It's mentioned 52 times in the Old Testament. So you need to understand this, that it was a part of getting a quick answer to prayer. Now, there are times that you and I can pray prayers, and we can afford, and I don't mean financially, we can afford in time for that prayer not to be answered for maybe 2, 3 months, 6 months to a year. Praise God, God's going to answer it, no worry. So we pray it, and we lay back knowing one of these days it's going to happen. What do you do, however, if your baby or your child or your son or daughter is in a car accident and has been rushed to the emergency room, and the doctor tells you that they may not have long to live? What do you do, for example, when the doctor tells you that you have cancer and you only have 2 to 3 months to live? What do you do, for example, if you've lost your job and the bills are coming due and you've got to have a miracle? Well, the way you have to pray is very significant, and I'm going to share it with you right now. Now listen carefully. In my dad's ministry, when my father would pray with this one word, he got the fastest answers and the greatest results of anything. Now, number one, and this is not the word, but let's just lay the foundation here. When you read the New Testament, when miracles happened in the ministry of Jesus, it says he was moved with compassion. Now, sympathy is human, but compassion has a divine element to it. For example, I can see someone in a bad situation and sympathize with them. But what compassion does, compassion moves you to help that person. For example, if you were to see children that need food and you knew it was a real situation, sympathy would make you feel sorry for the child, but compassion would move you to send money or food to help the child. So when Jesus is moved with compassion, he is moved with the desire and the ability to help that person now in a very bad situation. So I noticed in my dad's healing ministry that the greatest miracles he ever received when he prayed was when he felt a heart go out, his heart. Okay, you got that? The heart. Remember the breastplate of the priest? He carries the people on his heart. When my dad's heart would go out to the people that he needed to minister to, that's when he would receive a great healing miracles or testimonies of his prayers being answered. But this is important. Here's the word. Get ready. It's real simple. It's called the word burden. B-U-R-D-E-N. You read about it in the Old Testament where the prophets would prophesy or they would speak something, and it said, and the burden of the Lord came unto me, saying, and they would carry a burden. Now, a burden is a supernatural weight that God puts in your heart or that God puts on the inside of your spirit that really weighs you down to the point that you cannot do anything unless you make intercession and then unless you call on God on behalf of the situation that you're feeling heavy and that you're feeling burdened about. So the best way for me to describe a burden is this, that there's been times in my life that everything would be going totally normal, nothing going on wrong, nothing going on crazy, just everything's going great. And I would get out of bed that morning and feel very, very heavy. Now in my life, I don't know why this happens, but my family will verify this, that in my life there has been at least 12 times now, maybe more than that because it happened recently, probably up to 14 times, when I get what's called a death burden. And I get so heavy, it almost feels like a depression, but it's not a depression. But I get so heavy, I can't function, I can't study, I can't even feel like I pray, I can't work at the office. When that burden comes on me, I have to separate myself for example, and I have to go home and I have to do nothing but pray. And those about 14 times this has happened to me over the past couple years, someone I know dies within 7 days. It's always on the 7th day that they pass away, and I know it's going to happen. And so this is something that we deal with when we talk about the burden of the Word of God, how the burden of God comes to our heart and our life. And so I want to say something to you. When you are burdened and when you feel burdened and when you feel heavy, it's very important that you understand that you must not go shop that burden away, eat that burden away. You don't need to hang around people to try to get rid of a burden that God's putting in your heart. And the reason you don't need to do that is because if you try to get rid of the burden is a signal of a transition, and it's the signal that God is telling you something major is about to happen. And there are times that you can pray your way out of a situation when you are praying underneath that particular burden. So my dad, here's the point. Several different times in my life, I remember one time in my aunt's house, we were coming from Ohio back to Big Stone Gap, Virginia. I was just a young kid, and my dad got under this horrible heavy burden. He was travailing in my aunt's house, and we went down the road and had a car wreck. And so they fixed the car. A couple of days, it wasn't a major, it was just a fender bender. But several days later after it was fixed, he got under this burden again. We're praying, we're getting ready to leave. And my mom fell asleep behind the wheel, I think it was in the state of Kentucky, and almost hit an 18-wheeler head on. So my dad taught me when I was growing up, son, when you feel a burden, it's a signal of trouble, danger, or a warning, or a transition is happening. So when Dad would go and pray under those burdens, that's when he would get the greatest answers to prayer. So the mystery, this ephod holds a mystery to us, and that is that your most effective praying comes not only when you're praying in faith and you're praying in joy, but when you have a son that's lost, a daughter that's lost, a kid that's in prison, a daughter that maybe's got pregnant out of wedlock and you don't know what you're going to do, how your bills are going to be paid in the future, your job situation, and you go and get alone with God and separate yourself to God, and you begin to pray with that prayer burden. May I tell you that when you pray, pray until the burden lifts. Pray until you feel victory. Pray until you feel a breakthrough. Pray until you feel a relief. That's how you'll know God is going to answer your prayer as it relates to the significance of the key to answered prayer is praying your burden through. Pray your burden through. Pray that weight through. Now, having said that to you, I want to share something real quick with you that several years ago we were having a mentoring institute in Cleveland, Tennessee. And right before the institute, God spoke to me to go to our prayer barn and pray, and He kept saying, premature death, premature death. I knew that there was a death assignment that was coming, but it would be premature. And what happened was I prayed for 90 minutes under the heaviest weight, but I prayed till I broke through, and I prayed through. Now, Charlie Ellis, our office manager and VOE producer, is behind this camera and can verify this. He came out to me, it would be 2 days later, 3 days later, he comes out to me and he says, Perry, my mother just died at work and they had to revive her. I said, Charlie, she's going to be okay because I've already prayed through some kind of heaviness of a premature death. And of course, she's fine to this day, and that's several years later. Then right after that, I think it was the F4 tornado, I believe it was the F4, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, hit, and my wife's Aunt Bobby was thrown out of her house. Her house was devastated. She was thrown out of the house, they say about 50 feet away or whatever. A wall fell on top of her, but she survived that miraculously. Now, on another count, right after this, now we're talking about within 24 to 48 hours all this happened. We were at the T.L. Lowry Global Foundation Center having a mentoring institute. My wife calls on the phone and said, get everybody out of there. There's an F3 or F4 tornado headed toward Cleveland. And we could not get the people out because, I mean, the chandelier in the lobby was outside was already going sideways. The cars are bouncing outside. So I didn't know what to do. So we began to pray, and the Lord spoke to me and said, command it to split like the Red Sea. So Mark Casta, who was there at the time, went to the pulpit and began to pray. I said, Mark, command it to split like the Red Sea. Now, this was on radar, but we later found this out the next morning, that it's about an F3, F4 tornado. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was devastating because it took out hundreds of houses and killed people in our town. We never had anything like that happen since I've lived there in over 30-some years, but it was coming down toward Michigan Avenue and it split. Now, why it's important to understand that it was coming down Michigan Avenue is because VOE headquarters is there, and also 5 of our workers that work for our ministry have homes along that area all through the subdivisions there. And do you know it split? split, and it jumped the hill and took out a number of houses and did some severe damage, and the other side of it just dwindled away before it ever made it down to our offices. And so the thing that was amazing to me is that I believe the intercession that was the burden for 90 minutes to pray very heavily for intercession was something that spared a lot of people from premature death. Now, we had over 200 and some people at a mentoring institute at the T.L. Lowry Global Foundation Center. This is a few years ago when this huge tornado came through Cleveland, Tennessee. Nobody was injured, nobody was hurt, nobody was killed, no damage to any cars. And I believe, honestly, it was the prayer of faith and the prayer of praying under a burden. So I want to conclude the program by saying this to you. We all want to pray prayers that are effective. We want to pray prayers that are answered. We want to pray prayers that get answered. And prayer is more than just saying words. If you pray a prayer and there's compassion in your heart, remember the high priest had the breastplate on his heart. So the heart's very important when you pray. Pray with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your spirit. Then you carry the weight and the burden, and you begin to feel a burden that something is wrong. Somebody needs help. There's an emergency. There's a situation coming, and you begin to pray through the burden. Your most effective praying comes through the weight of prayer, the weight of intercession, and praying until the burden lifts. Now, what I have practiced over the years is when I have these burdens that hit, I'm telling you, they're misery. They're very heavy. It's difficult to function when you feel them. But if you will learn to get alone with God in your prayer closet, wherever that may be, in your home, wherever you go, maybe go to the church privately, but you've got to spend one-on-one face time with God privately with Him until you pray the weight off. If you let that weight linger and stay and stay and stay, it will not help you at all. You won't know what it's about. And for some reason, there are times that we have to stand in the gap and make up the hedge to break the spirit of death or destruction that might be coming in somebody's life. So this is my word to you today, coming again from Bethlehem, which is directly behind me, Jerusalem, which is directly in front of me. It's a cloudy day, probably when you watch the program. The sun's out, the sun's not out, the sun's out, the sun's not out. But that's what you got to deal with on a Holy Land Tour with Perry Stone when it's a taping on location. Now, we always make available to you something. It's either sometimes a DVD, sometimes a book, sometimes a CD. And I want you to get the material that we're putting out because it helps keep Manna-Fest on the air. Please remember that. And it's available only through our ministry. I'll be back in just a moment.
Messages from the main event are now available on CD and DVD. Don't miss these 5 new prophetic messages by Perry Stone and 3 amazing messages by some of America's most anointed ministers. Perry's 5 messages are titled Prophetic Insight into the New Jewish Year 5778, America's Prophetic Cosmic Wars, Demons and Angels, The Chronicles of Counting Prophetic Time, The Sign, the Shaking and the Seal of the Covenant, and Should a Christian be a Prepper? In these teachings, Perry shares the stunning prophetic implications concealed in the Jewish New Year 5778. Discover the 6 warfare lessons and the 4 repetitive patterns in history in his message about cosmic wars. Learn how God counts prophetic time with revealed and concealed set times and how false covenants are initiating the time of the end. Perry shows the rabbinical messianic age sign linked to the Jewish menorah and delves into the controversy of Christian prepping, giving biblical answers dealing with the subject of being prepared for a major crisis. Also included are 3 dynamic messages by guest speakers presenting practical truth for your spiritual growth. Jensen Franklin explains how to be made whole. Ron Carpenter helps you get into the mind of God as he details unlocking the mystery within the mystery. John Kilpatrick delivered a powerful message on releasing the power of the blessing that will change how you speak over your children, family, and church. The 8 CDs are available for your donation of $55 or more. DVDs can be yours for a donation of $95 or more, which includes special pictures and scriptures used by our speakers. To request your set of CDs or DVDs of the main event, visit our website at perrystone.org or call our toll-free number 1-888-21-BREAD. That's 1-888-212-7323. You may also write us at Perry Stone, P.O. Box 3595, Cleveland, Tennessee, 37320 and request offer number 17ME-CDs for $55 or 17ME-DVDs for $95. Shipping and handling are included. We believe you will enjoy the powerful teaching and preaching from the main event and the great spiritual understanding and encouragement it will bring to your life. We look forward to hearing from you soon.
This program was taped on the outskirts of Bethlehem, and I wanted to show it during the Christmas season because of all those sheep that gathered around. It happened suddenly, it was unplanned, but I really hope that you've enjoyed this, and we want to greet all of you, whether you celebrate traditional Christmas or Hanukkah. Maybe you don't celebrate anything, but you are a believer in the Lord. We want to just say have a great season with your family and friends, and just have a great time. Dr. Brian Cutshaw, we're at the ISO School of Ministry, actually School of the Word, our Internet Bible School that's going to be launched in January. Dr. Cutshaw had a little booklet one time that he gave me. Give us about, in the next 3 minutes, some of the traditions of Christmas. People don't know this. I didn't know this.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people assume that Christmas is all pagan, and that everything was originated from pagan celebrations, but that's not really true. The early church actually started most of the Christmas traditions that we have for evangelism purpose. For instance, the first time a Christmas tree was ever seen or introduced, Saint Boniface was preaching a sermon. He was walking out in the dead of winter and saw this evergreen as an arrow pointing up to heaven. He cut it down, brought it into the church as a sermon illustration, and he encouraged the people to start bringing one into their home to be an arrow pointing up in the dead of winter. Well, that started the whole thing. It caught on. So later on, Martin Luther comes along during the Reformation and says, well, no one can see it in the window. Why don't we put candles on it? So Martin Luther, the great reformer, is the one that put the candles on the windows there in Germany. So the original Tannenbaum was a witnessing tool.
So you hear about St. Nicholas. Who was that?
Okay, St. Nicholas of Myra was a Catholic bishop, and he went around, he's known as a patron saint of benevolence. So he went around giving gifts. And there's actual stories, documented stories. One time there was a farmer who was going to have to sell his daughters. And so at night they would hang up their clothes by the fireplace to dry.
Including stockings, right?
And particularly stockings, because if their feet got wet, they would get sick.
Right.
So they hang their stockings by the chimney every night to dry. So Saint Nicholas of Myra dropped a couple of gold nuggets down the chimney for them to find. He wanted it to bounce into the floor, but instead it bounced into the stocking.
What?
And as a result of that, you know, people started saying, leave your stockings hung up by the chimney with care.
Yeah, the songs came along.
And, you know, after a while, a lot of this stuff became...
Did they hang fruit on the tree at one time? Is that a true story?
Yeah, no, it was decoration. Yeah, absolutely.
Represented the fruit of the Spirit in that day.
Everything was an evangelism tool. For instance, because this was catching on, they said, why don't we start putting candles in the windows? And what candles in the windows initially meant was, if a poor person comes by and sees a candle in the window, then there's food on the inside.
Oh, really?
So you put candles in the windows so people would know where to come and get food at Christmas time.
Oh, my goodness.
Here's one of my favorite, is the wreath on the front door. It was originally holly with red berries to symbolize the crown of thorns on Jesus' head and the drops of blood. The green was life, the holly thorns were the crown of thorns, and the red berries were
So really what happened
blood.
is, over the years, and we're almost out of time here, over the years it developed into traditions and it became commercialized, and that's kind of where it went after all of it. But the thing is, it's a tradition. America has the traditions of singing the national anthem before a game, which is being challenged now. We have the tradition of July 4th. We have the tradition of Thanksgiving.
Yes.
And these are traditions. So whether or not you like tradition or honor tradition, that's personally up to you. You got to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. But we do know that some of my greatest memories was at my grandparents' house during this time of the year. So once again, as we're concluding out the program, I trust you enjoyed it, and we want you to watch next week as we bring you some powerful teaching from Israel. Don't go anywhere next week. We'll see you then.